Hello, welcome Exiles, and by Exiles I'm referring to the people following the Stormweaver Archmage build, and those of you who were playing Cast on Freeze and are now looking for a new build. I think I might be able to help you if you're playing Stormweaver. This character ends up doing quite well. It's been very good up to T12 maps. I'm working my way through to T13, 14, 15, and I haven't had really any issues to this point. Now, I just want to shout out the fact that I did, in fact, add a planner setup to max roll, and I will leave a link to this in the description, which has gem setups. It has all my gear. It has my entire tree, just so you can see that all in a nice format and hover around what you want when you want. I didn't know max roll had this tool set up yet. Otherwise, I would have done this sooner, so I apologize for that. I didn't know there was the resource for this. Later on, as I min-max the character, I would like to make an actual formal written guide with progression and stuff like that. But for right now, this will just hopefully make it easier to copy what I'm doing, because I'm still wanting to re-optimize and figure out what's the best way to do things. I don't want to make a full written guide, especially this early on when so many things are getting changed, nerfed, and buffed, etc. And I want to make sure I have a good idea of how I'm building the character. I have definitely refined it. I've redone my passive tree 3 or 4 times now, re-optimizing for what's more efficient. And so I'll keep that in mind going forward when we work towards making a guide on the character. Now, as for the upgrades we've made since the last video, if you've been following along with this progression, we most importantly did a fairly sizable tree swap. You might remember we were pathing up here through this cross section and over, and we had mana recovery. The upgrade we made from swapping out of that pathing is we basically traded a bit of our mana sustain to get additional skill effect duration, and then we have now access to better mana nodes in terms of 3% mana, or I should say better stun threshold nodes. We were taking these stun threshold nodes, but now we're taking these ones which come along with 3% mana and 3% ES, as well as getting access to enhanced barrier, which is 1 max res and some good ES nodes. I just think this is slightly stronger power-wise, and we got a little bit of additional ES from our pathing this way. It looks a little bit weird, but I think this is a overall upgrade. If you want to keep having a little bit higher mana sustain, Arcane Blossom will net you another 100 mana net regen, so that's up to you if you want to make the swap. I think this is better, but you can make that decision for yourself. So that was the main tree change. As for changes on gear, we upgraded, I believe, our rings slightly and maybe our shield. We're still just trying to optimize towards fixing our resistance for the higher tier maps. You'll notice now my character has mostly cap res for red tier maps, whereas previously in yellow tier maps, we had undercap on both like lightning and cold. So I'm continuing to hopefully improve that. Ideally, my current character, I have a bunch of res on my rings, for example. I'd like these res rolls to be on my body armor, my helmet, and my boots. Things which I need to improve upon, but for right now, the res is getting carried through partially my rings. Eventually, I want to get to the point where I can have mana regen, cast speed, and rarity or another res roll. But mana regen and cast speed are really strong suffixes that you can't get on these other gear slots, and I like those more on rings. But the fact is I'm having so much mana struggles that until I get res rolls on these items, I have to stick with having res rolls here. So just know the prioritization of gear. If you can get res on your other gear pieces, cast speed and mana regen are huge on rings along with flat mana rolls. Those are probably the 3 most important stats on rings. Also, I want to go over some other gear prioritization for those that are like trying to recreate this build. What's the most important damage stats? Plus levels are very important. Percent damage is very important. Cast speed is very important for weapons, damage mods. And then, of course, if you can get extra mana, extra int, mana regen as extra tertiary stats, that works as well. If you're wondering about, I have 2 options in front of me, like say you have 2 wands and you're trying to figure out what's better. Honestly, looking at the tooltip change when you swap a weapon in and out is a good way to tell. This tooltip might not be accurate for how much damage you're dealing, because it doesn't tell you how many times you're hitting with spark. It doesn't tell you how much minus raise you have on the enemy. It doesn't tell you, oh, how much power do I have on Sigil of Power. Well, technically, I could go pop Sigil of Power and then start spam casting, and then it would show that. But that's neither here nor there. Anyways, so that's the damage priorities on wand. As for chest piece, helmet, these are most important to get ES rolls, and then a bit of mana on helmet. If you can get a high tier mana roll, that's ideal. As for your amulet slot, Everlasting Gaze is the most important gear slot. It's what allows us to click Eldritch Battery over here, as well as give us ES when you wouldn't expect to. Conversion and gain mods work differently in PoE 2. They don't chain together. They work in one singular instance, and they happen in a specific order. For example, Eldritch Battery conversion takes place before the gain mod from my amulet. So you'll notice between my ES right now, 4,639, believe it or not, all of that is coming from one singular amulet mod that says gain 30% mana as extra ES. You can go without this initially. I think it's fine having like some mana plus levels. You'll be a bit higher damage. You'll be much squishier. But I would recommend, as soon as you can afford it, getting this amulet. It is a big defensive upgrade, and I think it's really good to optimize for. Ultimately, there's a few different ways you could play the character. You could play it as no Eldritch Battery plus just ES gear, which is probably the most tanky option. You could do what I'm doing with Everlasting Gaze plus Eldritch Battery, which is kind of an in-between version where it's decent damage, decent defense. Or you could just go full balls to the wall offensive, where you don't use this for extra ES, and then you lean into an amulet that has 10% mana, high mana roll, plus levels. Like, you could do that. So there are options of how you want to build this character. I'm playing something in the middle ground of where I think I have a decent mix of defense, and I get to click Eldritch Battery for more mana, which is better for damage scaling. So you can make up your own minds on how you're doing that. As for other defensive layers, speaking of the shield, these nodes are just too good in my opinion. They fixed block. Apparently block was not blocking enemies if they attacked from like behind you, and now it is, which makes sense. Immediately after the patch yesterday, I felt a big improvement in how consistently it felt like I was blocking and avoiding damage. And I just can't imagine not doing this. Block, we have about 58 block chance, and that is just from these block nodes, and one shield with increased block chance. Ideally, the higher increased block chance you get, the better. For example, if we go from 45 or 40 to 45 block, we would go from, I believe, 58 to probably 65-ish, around there, because of that improvement in getting block chance where these nodes scaled based on how good your shield is. So that's the gear priorities. Decent block shield, good damage scaling wand. If you can get damage scaling on rings, ideal. This amulet is very important defensive. You can play the build before it, but you're just going to be a lot squishier. Once you get the amulet, you'll start cruising defensively. And then as for gearing, high ES on helmet, body armor, and then prioritize high mana rolls on boots and gloves, along with, you know, movement speed, res, stuff like that. So that is the character. As for if you're wondering about the CI swap with Archmage or Mind Over Matter CI, I didn't do this till I was later in the character, when I had about, 3,000-ish mana and the ability to have 3k ES from Everlasting Gaze. Do not worry about forcing in CI and Mind Over Matter until you can afford a Midnight Braid and probably this amulet and being about that 3k number, at which point you need to make sure when you do that you can socket in Inspiration. Otherwise, you will just spend down your mana too quickly. Right now, we still have a negative spend. I'd like to eventually get that so we're net sustaining, which I think will happen once I get mana regen on both of my ring slots, which I have not done yet. So that's just a little update on the stuff we're doing in the character. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this update. And yeah, I'm going to continue to stream the build each day, and hopefully you guys are liking the progress and enjoying the build. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out. Have a good one.